The matriarch stood before the war council like a tower of black glass and fury, her forearms folded behind her back, her compound eyes burning with the cold light of absolute certainty. She was Sa'ul, queen of the Velkari Dominion, ruler of 11 star systems, commander of the largest insectoid fleet in the known galaxy, and she had grown very tired of humans. "Every empire that has tried to destroy them has failed," she said, her voice clicking through the translator like stones dropping into a metal bowl. "The Rithani warned us, the Gorvathi warned us, even the Pale Syndicate sent a message before they collapsed, and every warning says the same ridiculous thing: do not provoke the humans." She turned to the massive viewport behind her, where the shattered remains of a blue-green world hung in the black, like a broken egg. "That was their colony," she continued. "New Meridian, they called it, and we burned it in 9 hours. When we burned it." No one in the council answered. "Nothing," the matriarch hissed. "Nothing happened. No superweapon, no divine intervention, no galactic fleet screaming out of the void. Just fire and silence, and 35 survivors floating in a broken shuttle." She let the silence sit for a moment. 35. That is all that remains, and among them is a commander, a soldier of their frontier rangers, and I intend to break him in front of every camera in this sector of space. And when he kneels, when he begs, the rest of humanity will see that their so-called persistence is nothing more than stubbornness dressed in myth. The council murmured approval, all except one. Tika, the youngest scholar aboard the station, shifted in his seat and said nothing, but his antennae trembled. The shuttle bay of the Throne of Silk smelled like burning metal and fear. Commander Jonah Marin was the first one dragged out, not because he resisted the law, but because he was the best of the worst. But because the guards had been told to make an example of the biggest one, and Marin was big. 6'3", wide across the shoulders, with a jaw like the edge of a shovel, and hands that looked like they had been built for pulling apart problems one piece at a time. They had already beaten him twice during transit, once when he shielded a wounded corporal from a shock prod, and once when he simply refused to move fast enough. And now his left eye was swollen shut, and his lip was split down the middle, and his wrists were locked in bioelectric nerve chains that sent a spike of white-hot agony through his body every time he so much as twitched a finger. He did not make a sound. Behind him came the others, 21 soldiers in various states of injury, 9 civilians including 2 engineers and a teacher, and 1 child. The child was a girl, 9 years old, with dark braided hair and calm brown eyes, and a name that did not match the world she had been born into. Her name was Lily. She walked out of the shuttle bay without being dragged, without crying, without looking at the floor. And every guard she passed felt something they could not explain, a small, cold pinch at the base of their spine, as if some ancient instinct buried deep in their biology was trying to tell them something important. One of the guards, a junior drone named Vesk, leaned down and clicked his mandibles at her in what passed for a Velkari laugh. "Do you understand what is happening, small one?" he asked through the translator. "Your alpha has been selected for correction. He will be made to kneel before the matriarch, and then you will all learn your place." Lily looked up at him. She did not blink. "Do you know what a honey badger is?" she asked. Vesk tilted his head, confused, and then laughed again, and shoved her forward. They put the prisoners in the lower cells, long rows of transparent enclosures, designed for species much larger and much more dangerous than humans, and the walls hummed with a frequency that made the teeth ache and the eyes water. Marin was separated from the rest and placed in a solitary cell at the far end of the block, his nerve chains anchored to the floor by a magnetic clamp that held his arms at his sides, like a man being crucified, standing up. Every 30 seconds the chains pulsed, and every 30 seconds his body convulsed, and every 30 seconds he bit down on the inside of his cheek and swallowed the scream before it could escape. He could see the other prisoners through the transparent walls, and they could see him, That was the point. 3 levels above, in the archive chamber, Tika was reading very fast and growing very afraid. He had searched the galactic database for everything ever recorded about humans, and the results were not reassuring. The Gorvathi had enslaved a human colony 200 years ago, and within a single generation, the Gorvathi Empire had fractured into civil war. Because the human slaves had learned the Gorvathi language, infiltrated their political caste, and turned them against each other without ever picking up a weapon. The Pale Syndicate had tried to use humans as biological weapons, pumping them full of combat drugs and dropping them on enemy worlds, and it had worked beautifully right up until the humans decided they did not want to be weapons anymore, and dismantled the Syndicate from the inside in 11 months. The Rithani, the oldest and wisest species in the galaxy, had never fought the humans at all, and when asked why, their ambassador had simply said, "Because we are lies." Tika compiled the warnings into a report and ran to the matriarch's chamber. She read it in silence. Then she dropped it into the incinerator. "Propaganda," she said, "written by cowards. Every species that lost to the humans, lost because they were weak. We are not weak. We are Velkari, and we do not fear small creatures with soft skin and short lives." Tika opened his mouth to argue, but the matriarch's eyes locked onto him with a look that said the next words out of his mouth would be his last, and so he closed it. He bowed and left. And as he walked back to his chamber, he passed the cell block, and through the transparent wall he saw the child, Lily, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her cell, perfectly still, watching Commander Marin with an expression that did not belong on the face of a 9-year-old. It was patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for rescue, the patience of someone waiting for a plan to finish cooking. And for the first time in his life, Tika understood what the Rithani meant when they said they were wise. In his cell, Marin opened his one good eye. Across the block, through the glass, Lily met his gaze. She gave him one small. He closed his eye again. Not in defeat, in preparation. The chains pulsed and his body shook, and somewhere deep inside his nervous system, in a place the Velkari scanners could not see, something very old and very patient began to wake up. The honey badger had been caged, and the cage had just started teaching it exactly how the lock worked. On the 3rd day, they dislocated his right shoulder, and put it back, and dislocated it again. On the 4th day, they stopped feeding him. On the 5th day, they flooded his cell with light so bright it burned through his eyelids, and played a sound at a frequency designed to make mammalian brains feel like they were being slowly pulled apart from the inside. And every single day, twice a day, they dragged Commander Jonah Marin into the central chamber of the Throne of Silk, and stood him before the other 34 prisoners, and the matriarch's floating cameras, and they said the same thing, "Kneel." And every single day, twice a day, Marin stood. Sometimes he stood on legs that were shaking so badly the guards thought he would collapse on his own. And sometimes he stood with blood running down his chin from where he had bitten through his own tongue to stay conscious. And once he stood on a leg that the medical scan later confirmed was fractured in 2 places. And the Velkari doctor who reviewed the scan said that standing on that leg should have been physically impossible, and yet the human had done it without making a sound. The matriarch watched each session from her command throne with her 4 arms folded, and her compound eyes flickering with something that had started as amusement, and was slowly, day by day, turning into something else. She did not have a word for it yet, but Tika did. The word was unease. Marin had been a frontier ranger for 14 years before New Meridian, and the rangers were not like other soldiers. Other soldiers trained to fight, and rangers trained to survive. And there was a difference between those two things that most species in the galaxy never understood. Fighting meant you believed you could win. Surviving meant you had already accepted that winning might not be possible, and you had decided to keep going anyway. When Marin was 26, he had been stationed on a frozen moon called Barrow's Reach, and a reactor failure had killed the outpost's communications and heating in the same instant. And 6 colonists had been trapped in a secondary HAB unit 12 kilometers away, across open ice, in a storm that dropped the temperature to 90 degrees below zero. Marin had walked those 12 kilometers on a broken leg, with nothing but a thermal blanket, and a mining pick he used as a crutch. It took him 11 days. When the rescue shuttle finally arrived, they found Marin sitting in the HAB unit, surrounded by 6 alive colonists, and he was conscious, and he was calm. And when the medic asked him how he had possibly survived, he had said, "I just kept walking." That was the thing about humans that the galaxy kept failing to understand. They were not the strongest species, and they were not the fastest, and they were not the smartest, and they certainly were not the most dangerous in any single measurable category. But they were the only species in the known universe that could look at something impossible and simply refuse to acknowledge that it was impossible, and then do it anyway, not through some magical ability, but through the brute force application of stubbornness and pain tolerance, and a deeply irrational refusal to quit. The Valkyrie called it defiance. The humans called it Tuesday. While the matriarch focused all her attention on breaking the commander, she made the mistake that every predator in history has made when hunting a honey badger. She ignored the small one. Lily was 9 years old, and she weighed 52 pounds, and she had the face of a child who should have been worried about schoolwork and friendships and what flavor of ice cream she wanted after dinner. And because of this, every single Valkyrie guard who walked past her cell dismissed her completely. This was a very serious error. Lily's mother had been a diplomatic translator, one of the first humans trained to communicate with insectoid species. And before the Valkyrie had killed her during the bombing of New Meridian, she had taught her daughter 3 things that most adults never learn. First, she taught her that language is a weapon sharper than any blade, and that if you can speak to someone in their own tongue, you own a piece of their mind. Second, she taught her that every system has a pattern, and every pattern has a gap, and every gap is a door if you are small enough and patient enough to find it. Third, she taught her that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one holding the weapon, but the one who has already decided what happens next. Lily had already decided what happened next. On the second night, she began counting, and by the third night, she had memorized the guard rotations down to the half-minute, and she knew that there was a 40-second window every 2 hours when the corridor outside her cell was completely unwatched. On the 4th night, she began talking to Tika. The young scholar had been assigned to monitor the lower cells, and he was the only Valkyrie who seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. And Lily had noticed this the way a hunter notices a branch that bends differently from the others. She told him stories about Earth. She told him about oceans so wide you could sail for weeks without seeing land, and mountains so tall their peaks scraped the edge of space, and forests so old the trees had been alive before the Valkyrie had discovered fire. And she told him about honey badgers. They are small, she said, sitting cross-legged behind the glass, her voice soft and clear. Smaller than most predators on our world, and everything tries to eat them. Lions and leopards and hyenas and snakes. And the honey badger does not care. It fights back every single time. It has been bitten by cobras and gotten up. It has been buried alive and dug itself out. It has been set on fire and kept going. And do you know why? Tika leaned closer, his antenna pressed flat against his skull. Because it refuses to believe it can lose, Lily said. And Tika felt that cold pinch again, that ancient, nameless warning, crawling up through his biology like a whisper from a forgotten god. On the sixth night, Lily began stealing things: a frayed wire from a broken light panel, a capacitor chip from a discarded guard communicator, a tiny sliver of conductive metal she pried from the edge of her cell's drainage grate, and she hid them inside the lining of her jacket with the careful, practiced hands of a child who had grown up on a frontier colony, where you learned to fix things or you died. Nobody noticed. She was, after all, just a child. On the seventh day, the matriarch ordered a full medical scan of Marin before his next session, because she wanted to know exactly how close he was to breaking, and the results were delivered to her personal screen by the station's chief medical officer, a Velkari doctor named Saral, who had been performing biological assessments for 40 years and had never once been frightened by a medical scan. Until now. His adrenaline is not dissipating, Saral said, and his voice had a tremor in it that the matriarch had never heard before. In every other species we have studied, the stress hormones flood the system and then recede. It is a cycle, a wave. The body panics and then the body rests. But his body is not resting. What is it doing? The matriarch asked. Storing, Saral said. His adrenal glands are producing at a sustained rate, and his muscle tissue is absorbing the excess, and his neural pathways are— this should not be possible. His neural pathways are rerouting around the pain receptors that the nerve chains target. He is not enduring the pain, matriarch. He is learning it. Body is literally teaching itself how to process the specific frequency of our chains. And at the current rate of adaptation, he will what? The matriarch interrupted. Saral looked at her, and for the first time in 40 years of service, he could not keep the fear out of his eyes. He will become immune to them, the matriarch said. Nothing for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the viewport and stared at the wreckage of New Meridian, floating in the dark. And she thought about all those warnings she had burned, and for one brief moment, like a crack of light under a closed door, she felt something she had never felt before. It passed quickly, but it had been there. And down in the cells, chained to the floor, Marin opened his one good eye and flexed his fingers, and for the first time in 7 days, the chains pulsed and his body barely flinched. He was almost ready. And 3 cells away, Lily looked at the small collection of stolen parts hidden in her jacket and smiled. She was almost ready too. She had spent nearly 2 weeks pouring every tool of pain and humiliation the Velkari possessed into one human male. And he had not broken. He had not knelt. He had not even screamed. And the footage that was supposed to show the galaxy a broken and domesticated human instead showed something that was making the other species very, very nervous. It showed a man who could not be stopped. The view counts were in the billions, and the commentary flooding the galactic networks was not what the matriarch had expected. It was not fear of the Velkari. It was fear for them. And species that had never said a kind word about humanity were now posting the same message in 100 different languages. Let them go while you still can. The matriarch did not intend to let them go. She intended to finish this. The order came at midday station time. Every prisoner was to be brought to the central arena, a massive circular chamber at the heart of the throne of silk, designed for public executions and displays of dominance, with seating for 1,000 Velkari drones and floating camera platforms broadcasting to every corner of the sector. The 34 humans were marched in single file, their hands bound, their faces marked by 12 days of captivity, but their eyes still open and still sharp, and they were lined up along the curved wall of the arena like a row of candles waiting to be blown out. Marin was brought in last. They had to use 6 guards to move him, because the magnetic clamp on his chains had been increased to maximum power after the medical report. And even so, he walked under his own strength. And when they locked him to the post in the center of the arena, he stood straight and looked forward with his one good eye and did not move. The matriarch descended from her command platform on a floating throne, all four arms spread wide, her black carapace gleaming under the arena lights. And she looked magnificent and terrible, and every drone in the audience hall clicked their mandibles in unison, a sound like 1,000 locks snapping shut. She addressed the cameras first. "Citizens of the Dominion and observers of the Galactic Accord," she said. "For 12 days this human has been given the opportunity to submit, to accept the natural order, to acknowledge that his species is not what the myths would have you believe. And for 12 days he has refused." She turned to face the line of prisoners. "This refusal ends now." She raised one of her forearms and pointed at the line, and then she moved the arm slowly until it stopped on the smallest figure at the end. "Lily, Commander," the matriarch said, turning to Marin, "you will kneel, you will speak the words of submission into the camera, and you will do it now, or I will begin executing your people one by one, starting with the child." Camera turned to Marin. His face was a map of bruises and cuts and dried blood and exhaustion, and for the first time in 12 days, something shifted in his expression. Not surrender, not yet, but a weight, a terrible heavy weight, because he was a man who had spent his entire life protecting people, and now he was chained to a post, and a child was going to die because of him. He opened his mouth, and before he could speak, Lily moved. She stepped out of the line, not quickly, not dramatically, not with the desperate lunge of a frightened child. She simply walked forward, calmly, as if she were stepping out of a classroom to answer a question she already knew the answer to. And every guard in the arena trained their weapons on her, and every drone in the audience leaned forward, and the matriarch stared down from her floating throne with an expression that was half amusement and half confusion. Lily stopped in the center of the arena, 10 meters from Marin, and she looked up at the matriarch. She was so small. The matriarch was 12 feet of armored chitin and rage and power, and Lily was 4'2" and 52 pounds, and wearing a torn jacket with stolen electronics hidden in the lining. And she looked up at this queen of an empire, and she was not afraid. "On Earth," Lily said, and her voice was clear, and it carried through the silent arena like a bell ringing in an empty cathedral. "There is an animal called a honey badger." The matriarch tilted her head. "It is small," Lily continued, "not very strong, not very fast, and every predator on our world thinks it is easy prey. Lions bite it, cobras poison it, hyenas try to crush it, and the honey badger does not care. It gets up every single time, not because it is too stupid to know it should be dead, but because something inside it simply refuses to accept that losing is an option." She paused. "You chained your honey badger 12 days ago?" Her eyes moved to Marin, then back to the matriarch. "And for 12 days, he has been learning exactly how your chains work." The matriarch's mandibles clicked once, twice. Lily smiled. It was not the smile of a child. It was the smile of someone who had already seen the ending. "Before he gets loose," Lily said softly, "begin running." 3 things happened in the same heartbeat. The first thing was that Marin moved, not against the chains, through them, because for 12 days he had mapped every pulse of the nerve chains, every frequency, every gap between the electrical cycles, and he had taught his nervous system to redirect the current the same way a river teaches itself to flow around a rock. And in one explosive motion, he twisted his wrists. At the exact millisecond, the cycle reset, and the magnetic clamps stuttered, and the chains fell away from his arms like dead snakes. In the arena went dark. Lily pressed the button on the crude EMP device she had built from stolen parts. A wire, a capacitor chip, a sliver of conductive metal, and the battery from her own translation earpiece. And it was small, and it was ugly, and it should not have worked. But it did because the girl who built it had been raised by a woman who taught her that every system has a gap, and every gap is a door. The EMP killed the lights, killed the cameras, killed every electronic lock in the cell block below. and sent a feedback pulse through the station's communication array that would take the Valkyrie technicians 3 hours to trace and purge. But hidden inside that pulse, buried in the static like a seed in the dirt, was a distress signal, broadcasting on every human emergency frequency in the sector. The third thing was that the other 33 prisoners attacked. They had been receiving instructions from Lily for days, tapped codes on cell walls, whispered words during meal transfers, a language of tiny signals that the Valkyrie had never thought to monitor, because they were watching the commander, not the child. And every prisoner knew exactly which guard was standing next to them, and exactly where that guard's weapon was holstered, and exactly how to take it. The arena became chaos. Tika was in the archive chamber when the lights died, and he sat in the darkness for 3 seconds, listening to the screams and the crash of bodies and the sharp electric snap of stolen weapons being fired. And he knew with absolute certainty what had happened. The humans were loose. He ran, not toward the arena, away from it, down through the maintenance corridors to the secondary blast doors that separated the cell block from the station's lower docking level, and he stood in front of the door controls, and his hands shook, and his antennae trembled, and every warning he had ever read flashed through his mind. Star going supernova. He thought about Lily's stories. He thought about oceans and mountains and forests so old the trees had been alive before his species discovered fire. He thought about a small animal that got bitten by cobras and got up, and he opened the doors. In the arena, Marin was free, and he was moving. He did not run away from the guards. He ran toward them. His body was broken in a dozen places, and his nervous system was still burning from 12 days of electrical torture. And he had not eaten in 8 days, and none of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered, because he was a frontier ranger, and he was a human, and he had 34 people to protect, and the pain was just noise, and the damage was just a number. And the only thing that was real was the next step forward. He took a shock prod from the first guard, with a move that was not fast and not pretty, but was so brutally direct that the guard did not even understand what had happened until he was already on the floor. Then he took the next one, and the next, and every time they knocked him down, he stood up, and every time they hit him, he kept coming, and the Valkyrie guards began to back away, not because he was winning, but because they could not understand how he was still moving. And the thing you cannot understand is always the thing you fear the most. On her floating throne, high above the chaos, the matriarch watched a bleeding, starving, half-blind human dismantle her guards with his bare hands and a stolen shock prod. And the feeling she had felt at the viewport 12 days ago came back. In those 9 minutes, 35 humans, most of them wounded, all of them starving, one of them a 9-year-old girl, seized control of the central arena, disabled 46 armed guards, captured the station's internal broadcast system, and sent the matriarch fleeing to her command spire like a queen retreating to the last square on a chessboard. And then the real war began. The Throne of Silk was not a small station. It was a city in space, over 3 kilometers long, with 600 compartments, 42 decks, its own internal atmosphere recycling system, and a permanent crew of just over 10,000 Valkyrie drones, soldiers, technicians, and administrators. 35 humans against 10,000. Marin did not hesitate. "We are not going to fight 10,000 of them," he said, standing in the captured arena with blood running down his arms and a stolen shock prod in each hand. His one good eye scanning the group of freed prisoners who were looking at him with expressions that ranged from terrified to ready. "We are going to make 10,000 of them fight themselves." He divided the group into 5 teams. Team 1, 8 soldiers, would push toward the reactor level and begin selectively overloading secondary power nodes, not enough to destroy the station, but enough to force emergency shutdowns that would seal blast doors and cut entire sections off from the hive mind's communication network. Team 2, 6 soldiers and 1 engineer, would take the atmospheric processing center on Deck 19 and begin venting non-lethal irritant gases into the ventilation system of the upper decks, where the main barracks were located, because a soldier who cannot breathe without pain is a soldier who cannot think. Team 3, 5 soldiers, would hold the arena and the corridor junction that connected it to the lower docking level, creating a secure fallback point. Lily, she had already made her way to a communications hub 3 decks below the arena, using the maintenance shafts that Tika had opened. And she was sitting in front of a console designed for a species twice her size. Her small fingers flying across controls she had spent 12 days memorizing through the transparent walls of her cell. And she was doing 2 things at once: feeding real-time guard positions to every team through the captured internal broadcast system, and monitoring the station's external communications to make sure no distress call reached the Valkyrie fleet. Team 5 was Marin. He went up alone, toward the matriarch. The Valkyrie hive mind was the pride of their civilization. Every drone, every soldier, every officer was connected to the matriarch through a psychic network that allowed instantaneous communication, perfect coordination, and absolute unity of purpose. It was the reason the Valkyrie had conquered 11 star systems, the reason their fleet moved like a single organism, the reason they believed they were superior to every individualistic species in the galaxy. It was also the reason they were about to lose. Because a hive mind does not just share thoughts, it shares fear. When the first reactor node overloaded on Deck 31, and the blast doors slammed shut, and cut off 200 drones from the network, the matriarch felt it. A jolt of confusion and panic from 200 minds suddenly going silent, like 200 candles being snuffed out at once. When the irritant gas flooded the upper barracks, and 1,000 soldiers began choking and stumbling and clawing at their own breathing membranes, the matriarch felt that too, a wave of pain and terror that rippled through the hive mind like a stone dropped in still water. And when her guards on Deck 12 reported that a single human was walking toward the command spire, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him twice over, carrying a shock prod in one hand and a broken piece of metal railing in the other, and that he was not running and not hiding and not stopping, no matter how many times they hit him. The matriarch felt the fear of every guard who faced him, and that fear multiplied through the network, and 10,000 Valkyrie felt the terror of facing something they could not stop. The hive mind did not coordinate a response. The hive mind panicked. 3 decks below the arena, Lily was working. She had intercepted 14 internal communications in the last 6 minutes, and rerouted them to dead channels. And she had locked out the matriarch's command codes from the docking bay controls, so no escape pods could launch. And she was tracking Marin's progress through the station by following the trail of disabled security cameras and unconscious guards he left behind him like breadcrumbs. She was also talking to Tika. Scholar had come to her after opening the blast doors, trembling and terrified and certain he had just committed treason. And Lily had looked at him and said, "You did not commit treason. You chose the side that was going to win. Those are different things." Now Tika was helping her navigate the Valkyrie computer systems, translating command codes and explaining security protocols. And as he watched this small human child dismantle his species' most advanced military station from a console she could barely reach, he felt something that he would later describe in his academic writings as the moment I understood why the galaxy is afraid of them. "There is a communication trying to reach the outer fleet," Tika said suddenly, his antenna snapping upright. "I see it," Lily said, her fingers already moving. "Blocked. It is going nowhere." "But there will be more," Tika said. "The matriarch has emergency channels that bypass this console. Hardwired connections to the command spire. If she reaches them, she will not reach them," Lily said calmly. "How do you know?" Lily looked at him. "Because Commander Marin is between her and the spire, and nothing gets past him. Nothing has ever gotten past him. That is what he does. He stands between the danger and the people he is protecting, and he does not move. 7,000 kilometers away, at the edge of the star system, space tore open. 12 dreadnoughts and 40 escort ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a formation so precise it looked like a wall of steel and fire appearing from nothing. And the lead ship, the UNSC Retribution, was already broadcasting before its engines had finished cooling. "This is Vice Admiral Adelino Say of the United Nations Star Command," the message said, and it was broadcast on every frequency in every language the translator banks carried. "We have received a distress signal from this station. You are holding. Citizens of the United Nations of Earth, you have exactly 90 seconds to begin surrendering before we stop offering." The Velkari outer patrol ships, 6 cruisers and a carrier, turned to face the human fleet and then stopped, because the tactical officers on those ships ran the numbers, and the numbers said that 12 human dreadnoughts outgunned them by a factor of 40 to 1, and even the hive mind's blind loyalty to the matriarch could not overcome mathematics. They powered down their weapons. The carrier's captain sent one message to the matriarch: "They are here. What do we do?" The matriarch, barricaded in her command spire with the last of her personal guard, did not answer immediately, because she was watching the corridor feed outside her door, and on that feed she could see Marin. He was walking. Just walking. Not charging, not screaming, not wielding some terrible weapon, just walking down the corridor toward her door with steady, unhurried pace of a man who had all the time in the world. And the 6 guards she had posted at the corridor junction were on the floor behind him, not dead because humans did not kill when they did not have to, but very much unconscious. And the 2 blast doors she had sealed were open because somehow the child in the communications hub had overridden them. The matriarch opened a channel to the corridor. "How?" she said, and her voice was raw, stripped of authority, stripped of arrogance, stripped of everything except the desperate need to understand. "You have no hive mind. You have no natural weapons. You have no armor, no venom, no psychic abilities. Your species lives for less than a century. You are small and soft and fragile, and you should be broken. I did everything right. I broke your body. I broke your will. How are you still coming?" Marin stopped. He looked up at the camera. He was carrying Lily on his back, because somewhere between Deck 8 and Deck 6, she had come out of the maintenance shaft to meet him, and her ankle was swollen and purple from where she had jumped down a service ladder too fast. And so he had picked her up without a word and kept walking. "You did not break my will," Marin said. "You never had my will. My will is not something that lives in my body. It is something that lives in the fact that I have people behind me. And you put a child in a cage. And every human who has ever lived knows the same truth. You can break everything we have, and we will build it again. You can take everything we love, and we will find something new to love. You can chain us and starve us and burn our worlds, and we will crawl out of the ashes and stand up." The Velkari dominions sued for peace on the 14th day after the fall of the Throne of Silk, and the terms they expected were the terms that every defeated empire in galactic history had received: territorial concessions, military disarmament, economic sanctions, the slow, humiliating dismantling of everything they had built. That is not what happened. What happened was that 3 weeks after the surrender, a fleet of human ships arrived at the Velkari border colonies. Not warships, not occupation forces, but medical frigates and engineering transports and agricultural vessels carrying seeds and soil supplements and water purification systems. The humans rebuilt New Meridian, and then they helped repair the Velkari colonies that had been damaged during the war. The Velkari governor of the border sector sent a confused message to the United Nations Star Command asking if there had been some mistake, because surely the humans had not sent doctors and engineers to help the species that had just tortured their commander and threatened to execute a child. Vice Admiral Osai responded personally. "There is no mistake," she wrote. "We fight when we have to, and we stop fighting when we do not have to, and then we help. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. Your people are hungry and hurt, and we have food and medicine. The war is over. What kind of species would we be if we let your children starve because your matriarch made a bad decision?" The governor read the message 4 times. Then he opened his borders to the human aid ships, and something began to change. The Rythani Collective held a session of the Galactic Accord 3 months after the incident, and every species sent a representative, and the chamber was more full than it had been in a century, because everyone wanted to hear the same thing. They wanted someone to explain the humans. An ancient being named Soleth, who had lived for over 800 years, and had watched 17 civilizations rise and fall, stood before the assembly and spoke in a voice like wind moving through deep water. "You misunderstand the humans," Soleth said. "Every one of you, every empire, every collective, every hive and swarm and republic in this chamber, you all make the same mistake. You see their persistence in war, and you think that is what makes them dangerous. You see their refusal to die, and you think that is what you should fear, and you are wrong." Soleth paused and let the silence fill the chamber. "They are not dangerous because they are violent," Soleth continued. "They are dangerous because they are violent and kind, because they will burn your fleet to protect a child and then send doctors to heal your wounded, because they will fight you with everything they have and then refuse to be your enemy when the fighting is done. Like that, not because they are strong, but because even when you win, they will come to your door with bread and medicine and ask if you need help rebuilding, and you will let them in, and then you will realize that you never wanted to fight them in the first place." The chamber was silent for a long time. Then the Velkari representative, a young scholar with trembling antennae, stood up and said, "The ambassador is correct." His name was Tika. Tika had been granted asylum in human space 2 months after the incident, and he had settled on Earth in a small university town in a country called New Zealand, and he had never been anywhere so green and so quiet and so full of life, and every morning he walked to the campus through a park where human children played and shouted and laughed, and none of them were afraid of anything. He wrote his first paper in the 4th month, Persistence, Kindness, and the Evolutionary Paradox of the Honey Badger Species, and it was published simultaneously in the Journal of Xenoanthropology and the Galactic Military Review, and within 6 weeks it was required reading at every military academy and diplomatic school in the known galaxy. The paper argued that humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage was not their endurance or their adaptation or their tool use or their pattern recognition, it was their ability to form bonds with anything. Humans bonded with each other, obviously, but they also bonded with other species, with animals, with places, with ideas, with stories. And once a human bonded with something, they would walk through fire and ice and vacuum and death to protect it. And this was not rational, and it was not strategic, and it was not something that could be predicted by any military model in existence. And that was precisely why it worked. "You cannot wargain love," Tika wrote in his conclusion. "You cannot build a tactical response to a species that will die for a stranger." And that is why every empire that has faced the humans has ultimately failed. Not because the humans outfought them, but because the humans outcared them. The paper made Tika famous, but the thing that made him happy was simpler than fame. It was the fact that every Tuesday evening, a 9-year-old girl knocked on his office door and sat in his reading chair and told him stories about honey badgers while eating chocolate biscuits. And he told her stories about the Velkari homeworld, and they were friends, and the galaxy had not ended, and that was enough. Marin adopted Lily on a rainy Thursday 5 months after the Throne of Silk. There was no dramatic ceremony, no cameras, no speeches. Just a quiet office in a government building in Auckland, where a woman behind a desk handed him a piece of paper, and he signed it, and Lily signed it, and then they walked out into the rain, and she held his hand and said, "Can we get ice cream?" And he said, "Yes." He had retired from the Frontier Rangers the month before, and taken a teaching post at the academy. Survival training, the same curriculum he had lived 100 times in the field, except now he taught it in a classroom with windows that looked out over the ocean, and he went home every night to a small house where a girl who had once dismantled a space station with stolen wire and a capacitor chip was doing her homework at the kitchen table. She was 10 now, and she was already taking junior academy courses in communications, linguistics, and strategic systems, and every instructor who taught her reported the same thing. She never raised her voice, she never panicked, and she always had a plan. Marin sometimes watched her from the doorway of her room while she studied, and he thought about New Meridian, and the chains, and the arena, and the long walk through the corridors of the Throne of Silk, with her on his back, and he felt a feeling that he had not felt in a very long time. It was peace, not the absence of danger. He was a ranger. He knew danger never really went away, but the presence of something worth protecting, something small and fierce and impossibly brave, that had saved his life as much as he had saved hers. She looked up from her book one evening and caught him watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how the most dangerous thing on that station was not the commander with the shock prods," he said. "It was the 9-year-old with the stolen wire." She grinned. "Honey badgers are small," she said. "That is the whole point." Far away, on a planet orbiting a yellow star, in a system that most galactic maps still labeled with a warning symbol, a young alien cadet sat in the library of the Interspecies Military Academy and opened the Galactic Threat Database on his console. Was Gorvathi, tall, gray-skinned, descended from the same empire that humans had dismantled from the inside 2 centuries ago. And he was writing a paper on threat classification. And his professor had told him to look up the entry for Homo sapiens. He typed the name and pressed search. The old entry appeared first, grayed out and marked as obsolete. Species Homo sapiens, human. Classification Class 9 persistent predator. Threat level high. Recommended engagement avoid. Below it was the updated entry, added after the Velkari incident, glowing in red text that the cadet had never seen used for any other species in the database. Species Homo sapiens, human. Classification Class 9 persistent predator, Class 1 cooperative pack bonder. Threat level absolute. Recommended engagement none. Coexist and cooperate. Under no circumstances provoke hostilities. Do not capture. Do not cage. Do not threaten their young. If you have already done so, begin running. The cadet stared at the screen for a long time. Then he closed the database and started his paper with a different thesis than the one he had planned. On Earth, on a quiet evening in a small house near the ocean, a man sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. The sky was orange and pink and gold, and the waves were soft, and the air smelled like salt and rain. And somewhere inside the house, a girl was reading a book about honey badgers and laughing at the pictures. Marin closed his eyes and listened to her laugh, and felt the evening breeze on his skin, and thought about nothing at all. Lily came out a minute later and sat beside him with the book open on her knees. "Did you know," she said, "that honey badgers have been documented opening locked gates?" "I did not know that," Marin said. "Latch," she said. "They watch how it works, and then they open it. Scientists had to redesign the enclosures 5 times, and the honey badgers figured out every single one." "Sounds familiar," Marin said. She looked at him and grinned, and he grinned back, and the most dangerous species in the galaxy sat together in the fading light, and watched the ocean breathe, and did not need to say anything else, because this was what they fought for. Not territory, not power, not dominance, not the fear of other species. This, a porch, a sunset, a book about honey badgers, and someone to sit with. This was always what they fought for, and the galaxy was only just beginning to understand that the species that would burn a fleet to protect a child, and then rebuild the enemy's homes, and then sit quietly watching the ocean, that species could never be conquered.